Hey guys, Greg from FactionFab here to take you along our brake upgrade kit install on our 2008 STI. When we picked up this car, it had unknown brakes that were cross-drilled and slotted and pads that were extremely squeaky. If you followed any of our other videos, you probably can catch some of the squeaks as I stopped. And I even struggled with some brake fade on the car while performing some of the stopping tests during the suspension videos. So it's definitely time to put on fresh rotors, pads, lines, and fluid to maximize the Brembo braking capabilities. Now, a common misconception is that new brakes will make you stop sooner. While this can be true if you have been using inadequate products for the car, most brake setups are capable of stopping your vehicle within a safe distance. But the right brakes do have significant advantages that show in longevity, feedback, and heat capability. And choosing brakes that perform well in these areas will give you more confidence and predictability on your daily drive or on a track, making you the better driver who can stop faster. The F-Spec pads that we have are going to be aggressive enough for light track days while still being able to take you home in the same car. They offer good bite, low dust, and no noise, perfect for most Subaru owners who make the most of their car. The rotors are high carbon steel, machined to precise specs with added swept slots to provide consistent pad contact. The inner vanes and slots are bidirectional, meaning they can go on either the left or right side of the car for simplicity. The whole rotor inside and out undergoes an e-coating process before machining, capable of resisting corrosion through more than 400 hours of salt spray testing. They will look clean and rust-free no matter what climate you drive in. Also included are the brake lines designed to remove the soft and compliant rubber stock lines. These will send feedback directly to your foot for firmer pedal feel and predictable braking. Now let's go install these on our STI so I can show you some tips on how to do it. So here's some of the tools you'll need for the job. A ratchet, breaker bar, and torque wrench with various socket sizes. These can change depending on your application. Here we are using a 12, 17, and 19. You also will need some regular wrenches as well as a flared 10mm wrench. That's the bottom one you see here. This is an absolute necessity when removing brake lines. You will need a punch or skinny screwdriver, a dead blow mallet, needle nose pliers, a hanger tool, anti-seize lubricant, a wire brush, hand or powered will be fine, some sort of tool to spread the caliper, gloves, brake fluid, and a brake bleeder, or a friend will do fine if you don't have a bleeder. So because it's easier to take everything off while it's still connected to the vehicle, we are just going to break loose all the bolts, top and bottom caliper bolts, as well as the brake line banjo bolt. The second you break this loose, you can see there is a little bit of fluid dripping, so it'll be really important to have your drain pan underneath. Then we're going to go ahead and remove the brake pads. On Brembos, these are held in by pins and cotter pins and then the spring plate. So we'll start by removing the cotter pins from the side. They should come out fairly easily with a pair of pliers. And once the pins are out, you can use a small punch to push the pins through. And then your spring plate will also be released. Second pin. So once you release these two pins, you can just pull these pads straight out. Also want to take off the brake line bolt. So now we can take off the rest of the caliper. And make sure to hang the caliper up so we don't put any extra pressure on the brake line. So we got really lucky with this rotor where it basically fell off as soon as we pulled the caliper off, but there are two holes here that you can use to pull off a seized rotor. These are going to be M8 bolts, which are pretty common on Subarus. It's gonna be the ones that usually have a 12mm head. And all you do is you thread in each side. And then you take your wrench and you just thread each of them in alternating sides. And what this is gonna do is thread into the rotor and then push into the hub so that it holds the rotor as you thread it in. I would recommend using bolts that don't have a guide at the end. Let's do some that are threaded all the way through the end of the bolt. So also it's a good practice to clean the hub surface before you install your new rotor. One way to do it is just with a simple wire brush. You go through and you can clean off most of this corrosion. This might take a while. So we are going to use some power tools. This is just a simple air die grinder with a wire brush end, or you can use a little scouring pad end too. As is always the case when using power tools, make sure to use eye protection. One little bit of protection I like to always do is just put some anti-seize on this hub surface. It's going to make it easier next time you have to pull rotors off. So now let's pull off the line from the caliper so we can get this off and clean it up a little bit. All right, so we have our hard line that comes down here underneath the fender, and then this bottom portion is where we are going to unscrew the line. And then from here all the way up and over is going to be what we're gonna be replacing. So we're gonna start by removing the bracket holding the line on. You can simply do it with some pliers. And it's off. You can see this is now a little bit loose in here. If you can keep it down in the housing while you undo this bolt, it'll be a lot easier. It breaks loose. Then once it's broken loose, it's real easy to unscrew. And then we can pull our rubber soft line off the car. If you have your next line handy, you can just go straight on. Make sure to go through the bracket. And once you get it started screwing, it should stop leaking fairly easily. Just make sure you line it up and always do it by hand. And the top section of this is going to be 17mm. You hold it just with a regular wrench and then get back under here with your flare wrench. Remember, this does not need to be too tight, just snug. And then we're done with that. Our new bracket, make sure to do it with the tab pointing down away from you. And you will have to pull the line down into the bracket a little bit to get it in. Once you get it kind of on, a couple taps with a mallet. So one thing you will have to do before you put pads in and put the caliper back on is get the pistons pushed back into the caliper. You can see they do stick out just a little bit. On a more worn pad, they'll be sticking out farther, where mine weren't that worn. So this is a tool that we can use to do that, is a caliper spreader tool. And it simply is a ratchet that widens or retracts depending on where you need to go. So all we do is we push it into the caliper and then ratchet. And you can see our pistons are pushed in even with the outer surface of the caliper. Now we can connect the brake line back to the caliper. So I already have one crush washer on the banjo bolt. It's gonna go on the top, and then we will slide the other banjo bolt in underneath the brake line next to the caliper.
Next level.
Ready to put our rotor on. I'm just going to spray the back side with some brake cleaner to cut off any oil residue that it ships with. We can put our rotor on. I'm gonna go ahead and put a nut on here just to hold it in place while we work. Now we're ready to put our caliper back on. One thing the Brembos are notorious for is breaking these caliper bolts. Because you have an aluminum caliper with a steel bolt, it causes some galvanic corrosion. One way to prevent that is just a little bit of anti-seize. So I am going to make sure to coat the end threads of these bolts with the anti-seize before I put them on.
Next level, 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 level.
Before we put the pads in, we're going to need to grease the shim surface where it makes contact with the pistons. Then we can slide pad number 1 in, and pad number 2. Hardware's ready to go in. We have our pins we cleaned up. Notice there is the hole for the cotter pin that after we go through, we want that to be facing up out of the rotor to make it easier to get the cotter pin in. So we're just going to put one in here all the way through. Add our cotter pin. Now this one's locked in place. Now we can take our spring shim. The edges go down, and then it's going to be pushed all the way down so that we can get our other pin in place, and then our next cotter pin. And then we're done. And now we're ready to go do the other corners and finish up all of the install before we bleed the brakes. Bleeding the brakes really isn't too complicated. You have someone pushing on the brake pedal. When you pressurize the system and then open the bleed valve, the air will be forced out, leaving fluid in the caliper and all the lines. Then we close, release the brake pedal. You will want to make sure to keep the reservoir full as you are bleeding the brakes, especially if you're doing a full flush like we are. We're going to a DOT4 fluid, which has a higher heat threshold, but also requires more frequent bleeding. So we're doing a full flush of the system. So we're gonna watch this and keep bleeding until this is almost out, and then we'll fill it and then bleed the brakes. So then this caliper here is done, so we can clean it up a little bit. If any brake fluid spilled, put the cap on the bleeders. And we're done. So there is a proper order to bleed the calipers, and this is dependent on the year, make, and model of the car. So do your research and then do the brake calipers in the proper order to make sure you get all the air out of the system. that about wraps it up for this video. I'm gonna go ahead and put my wheel spacers and my wheels back on, and then I'm going to go bed in the brakes. A bed-in procedure is something we recommend with all of our brake pads, and that consists of 4 to 5 hard stops from 60 miles an hour down to 5 miles an hour. And it is very important to never come to a complete stop during this procedure, and the colder the brakes, the better. So first thing before you do any driving. Then once you're done, also at the end, make sure to not come to a complete stop by using the brakes hard. Try to keep them as cool as possible until the brakes are completely cold, and then you should be good to go. So if you have any questions, make sure to hit us up on our Facebook or Instagram, or comment below here on this video, and we will talk to you next time.